Hello everyone, Bag here, and welcome to my Ashveil teammate tier list, where we will look at all of his available team options to find out how he can best work on your account. If you want to skip the kit rundown and get straight to the list proper, then skip to this time. Otherwise, leave a like if you want more content like this, as it really does help, and with that, let's get started. Ashveil is a 5-star lightning hunt unit who is a revival to the follow-up attack archetype, being designed as a sub DPS while also working well as a main DPS. Ashveil revolves around charges to launch his follow-up attacks, where he can hold a max of 3. Other than starting with 3 charges at the start of combat, the only other way to get more is via his ultimate, which gives him a full 3 charge. Consuming charge is kinda similar to Cipher, where he always has one marked enemy automatically, and when an ally hits that marked target, he launches a follow-up attack while consuming a charge. And whenever the marked target is attacked at all by anyone other than Ashveil, Ashveil gets a fixed, very important 8 energy. The main unique thing here is that his mark's auto-targeting goes for enemies with low HP, rather than the usual targeting onto elite enemies. So he's kinda meant to pick off weakened enemies first, before then taking down the main health bar. His skill is a single target hit that can manually retarget his mark, but if he instead skills the enemy who's already marked, then he does more damage and gets refunded the used skill point. Meanwhile, his ultimate can also change the marked target without any drawbacks, while its mechanics are similar to Moze, being a big hit followed up by a follow-up attack. This follow-up attack afterwards has a stacking mechanic tied to it named Gluttony, which has a max of 12 stacks. You gain 1 stack by skilling, 2 stacks from using his follow-up, 2 from ulting, and 1 when his follow-up attack specifically kills an enemy. And for every 4 stacks you have when ulting, the follow-up attack after his ultimate's first hit gains an additional hit afterwards with the same amount of scaling. These extra hits are able to automatically retarget new enemies if the original enemy dies. So with enough Gluttony, you can have chains of kills of weakened enemies with the additional hits if you line things up correctly. Gluttony also gives some damage percent to Ashveil's follow-up attacks per stack, on top of the big amount of follow-up attack damage percent for free from his second trace. The final big thing about Ashveil is that he has pretty dang good buffs to the team, with a very large amount of Death Shred, as well as a crit damage buff that's semi-dependent on allies launching follow-up attacks. Ashveil's incredibly rocky pre-release cycle has made it clear that his intended role is as a sub DPS. As such, while I will talk about his main DPS potential later on, I think it would be better if we start by looking at his primary intended role as a sub DPS. Feixiao is probably who you think of first as a follow-upper in need of a follow-up attack sub DPS, although that's less to do with her own strength and more to do with how generally unneeded this follow-up attack sub DPS role really is in the grand scheme of things. Nevertheless, Ashveil and Feixiao have a rather symbiotic relationship. Ashveil wants frequent attacks from allies to get the fixed 8 energy for fast ults, as more ultimates means more charge, which then means giving more support to Feixiao. To get a 2-turn ult on Ashveil, we need about 8 attacks onto the marked enemy by the rest of the team in that 2-turn time frame. And Feixiao attacking 3 times per turn without even factoring in her ultimate is able to almost funnel that amount of energy by herself. Granted, this assumes every Feixiao hit is on the marked enemy, which is not guaranteed with how weird its targeting is, but it shouldn't be too hard to play around. Anyways, this role as a buffer with frequent hits needs to be directly compared to Cipher, in where his buffing is comparable to hers, especially since his Death Shred meshes really well with his signature's Death Shred, alongside better personal damage and more frequent hits. Cipher going 3 times per cycle gets around 6 hits, not counting the pot shot that she gets at the start of combat, or the extra hit where she actually uses her ultimate. Ashveil, with 1 ult per cycle and 2 turns, gets 7 hits, also not counting the extra 3 from his 3 initial charge, but getting 2 ults in a cycle can be somewhat feasible, leading to a total of 12 hits if all of his charge is consumed. So with generous energy, Ashveil can basically double Cipher's hit frequency, which is not bad. As for Ashveil's personal damage here, he can be somewhat self-sufficient in stats through his team-wide buffs that also apply to himself and his large amount of self-damage percent. So while he is losing an amper here compared to in a hypercarry team, and that does hurt his damage by a lot, he'll still generally be dealing as much if not more damage than Feixiao here, making this more of a dual DPS team instead of him being an actual sub DPS. He does also have mechanics that tie into his ability to deal damage, mainly through his extra gluttony by getting kills with his follow-ups, so it's nice that he can do that job just fine here, especially when Feixiao can also deal damage to soften up enemies for him to kill, since also she doesn't get the normal extra energy from getting kills due to her not having normal energy. This wasn't really a category that Cipher was competing in, so while Ashveil is significantly better, it's also basically a given. But let's stop looking at things solely from the standards of a rather dated team. He might be a big upgrade, but the real question is, does he make a big enough impact for this 2.x carry? A rather apt comparison we can make is to the Dahlia and her impact on Break. The Dahlia's impact on that archetype was enough to single-handedly revive the viability of every 2.x Break carry. By offering new types of support, while consolidating the most coveted existing support into a single package, she was an ultra-valuable pick for Break that was insanely strong within her niche. Ashveil, in comparison, is better at what he sets out to do compared to anyone he could be compared to. But the fact is, he is just not nearly as much of a difference maker as the Dahlia was. Or to put it more bluntly, not nearly as much of a difference maker as he needs to be. His personal damage is better, his amp is competitive, his attack frequency is better. These are all good things, but he's not doing anything new or revolutionary here that would truly revitalize this team. Granted, Feixiao is a very, very high ceiling character, and in heavy optimized play, any buff like this can be stretched to its limit. The problem with this is that all of Feixiao's optimized play is in sustainless teams, which Ashveil really struggles in due to his very low defensive base stats. So unless if you play around this, using a sustain to make Ashveil more feasible feels a bit like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So in general, is Ashveil an SGO teammate for Feixiao? Yes, no question. But is he enough to bring her up to the standards of the current meta, like how Break was treated in 3.8? No, not exactly. A plug here to subscribe. The anniversary, 4.2, is right on the horizon, so if you want this type of content for Evanescia, Civil Wolf 999, or Elation MC, then stick around. Alright, back to the vid. So, as you might guess from how he is with Feixiao, going over the other follow-up attack carries should be rather self-explanatory. While he can be a good stat stick for the likes of Tingyun, Ratio, Yunli, or even Clara, the problem is that they don't really benefit at all from his frequent attacks, while also still not giving him any damage amp besides the fixed 8 energy per attack. Yeah, 40 Death Shred and 120% follow-up crit damage are great to give by existing, but usually other ampers can do more than just amp, like DDD, or S0 access to amping light cones like Pearls, or action advances, or all the shenanigans with Cipher's ult. Ashveil exists. He has very competitive amp, he can be SP neutral, and he does a very good amount of damage. But no other dual DPS other than Feixiao can really pick up the slack here to make this a truly worth running team. What I will note is that he does become much stronger amp-wise with investment, with his S1 giving 20% vulnerability, and his E1 giving 24 to 36% more vulnerability, depending on the HP of the enemy. So if you favor him with your pulls, then yeah, he becomes a genuinely great amper. But the problem is that basically every amper also has really good vertical investment that is a lot easier to generally recommend. But yes, sure, you know what, why not? We can put like every carry in the game in the he's a good stat stick with investment category, and the follow-uppers can go into the Ashveil hypercarry is better instead category. There are some quirks to point out with this group, like how Jingyuan's reliance on Sunday makes Ashveil's damage even worse due to Sunday's single target buffs, or how Ashveil actually can fill the debuffing role for Ratio perfectly fine. But without heavy investment, again, he's not the savior for these carries in the same vein as the Dahlia was for Break. There are also some other cases, like Anoxa liking his Death Shred, and Archer can funnel energy into him really well, but the general rule for them is that they'll be much better off with their standard cores instead of using Ashveil. Although again, that can theoretically change with enough vertical investment. Also, specifically E1 Jade can be pretty decent with using Ashveil as the deck collector, I guess, but this is also more of a for fun strat than anything else. The third team slot unit shouldn't be entirely influenced by what Ashveil wants, but thankfully his wants are pretty similar to Feixiao's, so the potential options are relatively straightforward. Tribbie is the best third team slot amper in terms of giving a large number of hits, and also for the little known light cone known as DDD. With how weird Ashveil's targeting is with his marked enemies, having frequent AoE attacks is really nice for guaranteeing that she gives him his energy and consume charge, although you will have to be careful to not proc Feixiao's follow-up attack from her, as then you're likely to get screwed by her random targeting. Robin, on the other hand, is great for giving Ashveil and Feixiao more turns, and as Ashveil can be SP neutral, the team can remain relatively okay SP-wise, with Feixiao spending as much SP as the sustain generates, although in longer fights, you may need to basic every now and then, due to Robin maybe skilling in between ults, and due to the occasional SP negative Ashveil skill. In dual DPS teams, Ashveil obviously isn't dependent at all on the support or the sustain to consume his charge. Instead, the main issue with Robin is in not contributing to Ashveil's energy due to never attacking. If we assume Robin gives an extra turn per cycle to the team, that means 1 attack from the sustain, 3 from Feixiao, and 1 from Ashveil. That's a total of 62 energy to Ashveil, meaning a substitute to Robin would need to attack 8 times per cycle to be on par with her resource generation. Luckily, Tribbie can do so pretty easily. This also goes for Feixiao. The same assumptions means a Robin ult gives an extra 5 charges to her, which Tribbie can outdo by herself while spamming DDD. There is some implicit anti-synergy, of course, between an AoE-centric support and a hunt carry, but Archer has taught us that that alone can't stop these units from working great together. How often Tribbie can attack depends on both if she has her signature, which also massively improves her personal damage here, and on how many enemies there are on the field. But generally, even without DDD giving them extra turns, Tribbie will outdo Robin's main niche as the best general teammate in terms of balancing amp and attack frequency. This is also actually assuming Robin is getting consistent back-to-back ults, which is somewhat supported by the frequent follow-ups from the team, but especially with the lack of Ho-Ho, fast ults are still not a guarantee. Still, we are simplifying Robin's role control a bit here, as those extra turns from her action advance are also front-loaded, gaining instant damage and energy compared to slowly getting better value with Tribbie. There are also endless optimizations to be had, with things such as 0 action value Robin ults on the start of the second wave of MOC, which can lead to 2 Robin ults in one cycle. But generally, outside of highly catered and specified runs, Tribbie will just do better here. Cipher is also great as an alternative, giving worse attack frequency, no DDD, and generally worse personal damage compared to Tribbie, while providing generally better amp, which is not an entirely worth it trade-off, but it's not a terrible one either. It should also be mentioned that Cipher's damage with Ashveil's buffs can be a bit more relevant, so especially if you actually have a well-built Cipher, then her personal damage can actually end up being tangible here. I'll also say for Cipher in general, that it can be very frustrating to line up her mark with Ashveil's, as their respective auto-targeting criterias are kind of opposite to each other, meaning it can be very easy for Cipher to waste follow-up attacks not charging Ashveil. The team should be comfortable enough SP-wise to where Cipher or Ashveil should be fine skilling every now and then to line things up, but it is just still annoying nonetheless. I am going to place Cipher pretty high here, but that is partly due to her performance with Hypercarry Ashveil, which I'll talk about more later on. Using a third follow-upper besides Cipher, like Moze, Hunt March, or Topaz, could also be viable here, as we're increasing the synergy between each unit working off of each other's follow-up attacks. But each of their raw buffs or attack frequency are just so below average, and with this team not having the absolute best baseline level of performance for today's standards, not having any big raw amping on the team is a very big mark to not check off. We'll at least talk more about Moze later, but for here at least, all of these options are usable, but I wouldn't expect that great of a performance. And then at the end you have generic ampers who aren't notable for their attack frequency, like Ranmei, Silverwolf, or the good old Pela and Xiaoxiu, who perform around where they usually perform, which is to say Silverwolf and Ranmei can be great in their catered scenarios, while Pela and Xiaoxiu are Pela and Xiaoxiu. Although Def Shred is better than usual here, so Pela, Silverwolf, and Ranmei Z1 get a boost from that as well. Yao Guang can be artificially stronger in elation-chilling fights, but is otherwise meh, and Cyrene, I mean, E2 Cyrene can be decent for giving a free ult and full charge to Feixiao, but other than that, she's pretty unremarkable here. The last units to talk about before we get into him as a main DPS are the Sustains. Generally, the two options to choose between are Dipped and Aventurine, due to them having the highest potential attack frequency within their role. The simple comparison is that Dipped provides better raw amp, with a better baseline level of hits, while Aventurine can have a better number of hits if the fight has frequent AoE attacks. Dipped is more clearly best in slot in a hypercarry setup, where you don't have two carries that both want to be bondmate. But even here with two carries, Dipped's consistency generally still wins out. Other options like Lingsha and Hyacinth are still of course usable, especially with investment, but generally they will still be worse than the standard picks. And I am also obligated to put Ho-Ho kind of high for her naturally great utility, even if she gives no energy to Feixiao. But here she is, again, still generally outdone by the shielders. Okay, before we talk about any main carry teammates, I want to briefly talk about how valuable Ashveil as a carry even is. At the start of his pre-release cycle, Ashveil was in contention for being one of the best solo carries in the game. It was a popular idea that he was overtuned, and a nerf was expected. The scope of how hard he was hit by that eventual nerf depends a lot on how much you can make use of his 8 energy trace, which was given to him in exchange for those nerfs. But nonetheless, he is a bit weaker performance-wise compared to where he started. What we are left with is a perfectly fine carry that can get the job done just fine. I would say he's slightly below the average power level that you would want out of a 4.x carry, but he is far from unviable like some people have said. Still, being good is a tough sell when you're incentivized to pull for great units. So the Doom posting was a bit warranted, if not massively overblown, but don't let that take away from the fact that he is overall good. Anyways, for talking about his hypercarry team, a lot is similar to his sub-DPS role. The Dipped or Aventurine but probably Dipped debate is exactly the same, minus the fact that, again, there's no longer two DPSs competing for bondmate anymore. And in the third team slot, Tribbie is still the de facto default option here, although unlike with Feixiao, there are other much more competitive alternatives to talk about here. But first, for the second team slot, there's been a lot of contention with running action advancers like Sunday or Sparkle with Ashveil. As well, giving him more turns is great for energy, that can generally be at least adequately matched with frequent attacking allies who then provide either better amp or their own unique brand of utility. Sunday, with a 3-turn ult rotation, grants an average of 43 energy per turn, 30 from letting Ashveil skill another time, and 13.3 being a third of his ultimate, which gives 40 energy here. So an ally would need to attack 6 times per their turn to provide better energy, which for the majority of other supports is not very feasible. Sunday also has the advantage of working alongside Dipped for his free extra 50 damage percent, and like we talked about with Robin, there can be some advantages towards having a more front-loaded energy rotation instead of nickel and diming it through your teammate. rates. And Sunday's energy situation becomes even better if the enemy is generous with their hits, as getting Sunday's ult any faster than a 3-turn rotation dramatically improves how good he is here. The main issue here is that Sunday's amp is just not the greatest. Ashveil is rather saturated in damage percent already from his second trace, and beyond any saturation, most of Sunday's competition is just very strong amp-wise. While in comparison, that's not exactly Sunday's selling point. Most of Ashveil's non-Sunday teams can also get away with running attack boots, which further sullies Sunday's support. Sparkle is basically on the opposite end when it comes to balancing funneling and amping. She basically makes Ashveil act as often as her, which means the only energy that she can generate is due to the amount of extra turns that her action advance results in. This can be as low as literally 0 energy if her action advance doesn't result in any extra turns, or a high end of around 4 to 5 extra turns across 500 action value and anomaly arbitration, depending on if she has Eagle, DDD, her E1, and what her ult frequency looks like in a given fight. Either way, compared to most other units here, her energy regen is not her strong suit. In return, Sparkle provides basically the best amp out of any option. Ashveil is like Anoxa in having very high base attack while having close to 0 attack scaling in their base kit. So compared to Sunday, Sparkle gives around 90% attack through her buffs and in letting him run attack boots. And that's before the extra 40% that you could get from her E1. This then gets added onto her much less saturated buffs. Although vulnerability can be a bit saturated, specifically with Ashveil's vertical investment, or when paired with other teammates like Tribbie or Cipher. Really, when we get to the realm of relying on ultimates, the problem of thresholds inevitably pops up. Sometimes, Sunday's massive energy will lead to more ults, which can clutch up a fight, but other times, Sparkle's generally better damage will matter more instead. I would bet on Sparkle being generally better, but don't be surprised if Sunday can feel better, especially, again, depending on how much energy the fight gives Sunday. Ultimately though, just assuming Ashveil wants an action advancer at all is a bit meh, as his second team slot could instead be filled by another frequent attacking amper. Moze is by far the best unit in the game for frequent attacks, thanks to his Eagle ult strats. Essentially, even while Moze is departed, using his ult will still give him the Eagle action advance when he comes back, and with an ER rope, Moze gets a 1-turn ult assuming you have his E1. This combines with the action advance in his second trace to mean that he will be looping his departed state a lot, giving more energy than even Sunday in most scenarios. However, the downside is that Moze's amp is even more meh. 25% follow-up attack vulnerability and 40 crit damage from his E2 is all that he gives. He can also contribute a lot with his own personal damage, especially with Ashveil also buffing him on top of the third team slot amper, but you do generally sacrifice a good amount of his damage to fill this frequent attacking niche, through speed boots, in the rope, and even maybe Von Whack. Like with Cipher, there is also a bit of anti-synergy, with Moze wanting to complete his full departed state on a single big target, whereas Ashveil is designed to pick off small targets. But also like with Cipher, manually retargeting onto enemies to get around this isn't the end of the world. Moze is definitely a unit with a lot of optimization, so I could see him doing very well in very high-end runs, but his raw numbers are just so much worse compared to the competition, to where I don't think I can place him any higher than near the bottom of the S- tier. The much more down-to-earth attacking amper is Cipher, who, as we mentioned before, gives an okay-ish 6 hits or 48-ish energy per cycle, assuming you can get her to 200 speed with either God Relics or DDD help. This is obviously much worse than what Sunday gives, but like with Sparkle, she gives much better amp. So to compare her and Sparkle more closely, Cipher is slightly worse than Sparkle amp-wise, while being slightly better in terms of generating energy. I do think Sparkle slightly has an edge overall, but Cipher, as always, has her shenanigans that can let you skip over portions of some fights, which can make her role more valuable. Or you can have a fight like in Pure Fiction, where you have to waste her ult damage on 2 other unimportant health bars, which then can make her more meh. It ultimately depends, but I can't really say that you can go wrong with using her. I also want to quickly mention Tingyun as a genuinely pretty good option, as 60 energy from her ult at E6 is 50% more than Sunday's. And then you couple that with incredibly fast DDD spamming, and yeah, she's certainly not bad here. Her amping is still really behind the competition, but as I always say, DDD Tingyun strats will never be bad. And in sustainless teams, I can see her as a very solid 4th pick. Although, again, as we mentioned earlier, sustainless Ashveil can be a bit iffy with how frail he is, so keep that in mind. And the last amper slash action advancer that I want to talk about is RMC. And the reason I've taken so long to formally bring them up is that they kind of encapsulate all of what makes Ashveil's other teammates work. They have an action advance for more energy and scaling, while also not needing any strict speed tuning, which then still allows attack boots. They have strong amping with a mostly unique damage multiplier, and they have multiple ways to attack consistently, with their basic, ultimate, Mems AoE attack, and their joint attack, which counts as 2 hits, meaning that it gives Ashveil 16 energy. RMC really is the complete package, but they are a bit hard to place, as how much use you can get out of them endgame relies on a few iffy factors, such as how well you can play around Mem's charge, how much energy the fight gives, as RMC is similar to Sunday with really benefiting from that, and with the fact that their lack of real vertical investment, besides, like, stealing a signature, means that they can easily be outclassed if you have other options that you've put more investment into. But at a baseline, I think RMC is genuinely amazing here. With all of this glazing, you might expect me to say that they are the undisputed best in slot for the second team slot. But, well, let's get into that. Looking at his final team makeups, as a sub DPS, Ashveil's partner will basically always be Feixiao, where the sustain is basically always dipped, and the third team slot is preferably Tribbie with Cipher or Robin as alternatives. As a main DPS, things are much more contested. The sustain situation remains. But other than that, let's start with what we can call the default template, Tribbie Sunday. This is the best team in terms of raw energy, but as we've mentioned before, sometimes you want to tip the scales a bit less onto energy and a bit more onto amp. Sunday can be replaced by any other S-tierer. Sparkle has the best buffs but little energy, Cipher is slightly less amp than her but with better energy, and RMC brings amping, energy, and advancing while not being strictly the best in each individual category. Tribbie's selling point is being best in energy outside of Sunday, alongside good personal damage and DDD spamming, but she can't fall behind in lower enemy count fights, with her raw amp being slightly lower compared to Sparkle, RMC, or Cipher, so she can be replaced by RMC or Cipher on the same criteria as them replacing Sunday, meaning overall, the layout is just this. Slot 2 is Sunday, Sparkle, or the 3 other S-tierers, and slot 3 is one of the 3 other S-tierers. The only pairings I do not suggest are Sunday RMC, as buff up time will become a genuine concern, and I would also caution against Sparkle Sunday unless if you know what you're doing, as you need an incredibly fast dip to be single-handedly in charge of consuming charge. My overall personal recommendation would be Tribbie RMC, but the fact is that basically any workable combination here will have a relatively similar performance, which is also to say, don't take the ordering of the S tier too seriously. The ordering is intentional, but it is not strict or all-encompassing. It'll more so depend on the fight, what thresholds end up being relevant, and what vertical investment you have. One of Ashveil's greatest strengths is in working well with very little. He has no make-or-break unit, which is kinda rare these days, so you could just give him your scraps from what your other teams aren't using, and he will probably be fine. And that's everything. Going to the channel member corner, we have Ren of Heart, Cheap Paralysis Demon, and HSR Journey as our next new 6-month members. Thank you to all of you for your continued support, and well, with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!